Okay, gewaltig. So yesterday, what we were discussing was this halacha that according to Rabbah, does not apply to a knas. So using the knas of Daled Vehei as an example, if the Geneva itself was done through Komle B'derabimene, well, then there's a moment portion as well that's impacted by Komle B'derabimene. And since the moment portion, the Nezek portion, the non-Knas portion, will become potter because of Komle B'derabimene, so that will undermine the Chiyuv of Dal V'hei, and there will not be a Chiyuv Dal V'hei. But if the Geneva happened without a Chiyuv Misa, and only the Tvicha happened under a Chiyuv Misa, then in fact you would pay Dal V'hei because Komle B'derabimene will not impact the Knas. And that was the Shita only of Rabbah, and he was explaining why Reb Meir holds that if it's Tovach U'Machar B'Shabbos, where there's Komle B'derabimene normally, why does Reb Meir hold that there's a Chiyuv Dal V'hei? And the answer that Rabbah gave was Rabbah's Chiddush, that Komle B'derabimene does not pater a Knas, it only paters Mom. And that took us to the end of that sugya. And then we had a little bit of a Shaila of She'ela, how would that be impacted? And Rav Papa holds that the She'ela, the Chiyuv moment of the She'ela, doesn't happen until the animal gets removed from the Bailam's Rishus, and therefore, if there are children who yarshin a borrowed object that their father had borrowed, they won't have those chiyuvim, and the nechosim that the father left over would not be meshubed from the time of the beginning of the she'ela. And that takes us to our next step in understanding the Gemara, Bishlomo Rabbi Yochanan. So we have to go back to a question that we had a couple of days ago. And the question was, there was a steer between our Mishnah that says if someone violates a woman who's chayvit krisos, our Mishnah says that they pay knas. Yet there's a Mishnah at the beginning of Malkos that says that they get Malkos. And we had the problem of ein loiku mishalim. So Rabbi Yochanan said that if you have a case where there's a chiyuv of Malkos and a chiyuv of kares, such as all of the examples in our Mishnah, then Malkos trumps the tashlumin. So therefore, the person will get Malkos for violating one of these women that are chayvit krisos that also have with them a chiyuv Malkos, and they would not pay the knas. So how is it possible in our Mishnah that you pay the knas? It must be speaking without hasra. Since the perpetrator was not warned before, you can't give someone Malkos. Like Rashi says, you cannot punish somebody a punishment on their guf, such as Malkos or Misa, without warning them. Since you didn't warn the person, therefore they don't get Malkos, and that explains our Mishnayos here that says that they get a knas. Rish Lakish had a different approach. Rish Lakish wanted to say that our Mishnah was following the Shita of Reb Meir, who holds loiku mishalim. You get both, and therefore there's no steer at all between the Mishnah in Kesubos, our Mishnah that says they get a knas, and the Mishnah in Malkos that says they get Malkos, because they get both. It's not a steer. So, Frek the Gemara, Bishlomo Rabbi Yochanan Omer Karesh Lakish. I understand why Rabbi. So we're on Lamed Dalet Amud Beis, about 10 lines from the bottom. Bishlomo Rabbi Yochanan Omer Karesh Lakish. I understand why Rabbi Yochanan didn't want to say like Rish Lakish. The Kamoikim Lakarabana. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't want to say that our Mishnah is going to according to the Shita of Reb Meir, who holds loiku mishalim. He wants to say that it's going according to the Rabbana. Ela Rish Lakish, my timer loy Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Why didn't Rish Lakish like Rabbi Yochanan's pshat? It's a very good pshat that our Mishnah is speaking where there was no hasra, and since there's no hasra, there's no Malkos, and since there's no Malkos, you pay the knas. Amalach Rish Lakish will tell you, and this takes us into a whole new sugya of chayve misa shagir. Kivan the ilu asrubei pater. Since the chiv Malkos here, if you would have warned him, there would have been a chiv Malkos, Kiloi asru beinami pot. Even if there was no asra, and because of that, the actual punishment of Malkos could not be carried out, it doesn't change the fact that this Avera is an Avera that normally comes with Malkos. And therefore you still say, Ein Loika Umashal. Huge chiddush. So this shaila as to whether or not Chai v'Misha Shoyugin will pater Mammon or not, we need to understand the two studies. So Rabbi Chana Washman explains, the question is as follows. Does the Avera that gave him Malkos, does that overshadow the other Avera? And then it doesn't make a difference if he actually gets the Malkos or not. The Avera itself will overshadow the Avera and not trigger a Chiyuv Mammon? Or do you say, no, both Chiyuvim are triggered, but the greater punishment swallows up and includes the smaller punishment? So could be that Rabbi Yochanan holds that it's the greater punishment swallows up the other punishment. So in the event that there is no greater punishment, because there was no hasra for Malkos, then Avad you pay Mammon, which explains our mission. Rish Lakish holds it's the Aver that swallows up the smaller Aver. So if that's the case, there is no Chiyuv Mammon from the Aver itself, and therefore, even if they didn't warn him on the Malkos, he will still be potter from the Mammon. So Rish Lakish has no choice. Thank you very much. He's not able to explain away our Mishnah that it's speaking in a case where you didn't warn him for Malkos, because it doesn't matter. Even if you didn't warn him for Malkos, according to Rish Lakish, there would still be potter from Mammon. So Rish Lakish had no other choice other than to say that we're following the Shita of Reb Meir, who holds like Umashalim. Even if this is a Chayve Malkos, you still pay the Knas, and the Chiyuv of Malkos does not pater the Knas or the Mammon of the Knas. And we're not making up now a new Machlokes Reb Yochanan and Rish Lakish. In fact, we find independently that Rish Lakish and Reb Yochanan have an argument about this topic. Thank you, Chaim. So this is an old known Machlokes. The Chiyasar Abdimi, when Abdimi came, Omar, he said, what if somebody did something that would be Mechayiv Misa, but he did it b'shoyig, or there was no asra, such as Chilul Shabbos, or Mechayiv Malkos, such as in our case, where someone who was boil a woman who he wasn't allowed to, and there's a Chiyav Malkos, but he's not getting the Chiyav Malkos either because he was shoyig or he wasn't warned. V'davar acher, and there was another Chiyav that occurred simultaneously, like a Chiyav Mammon. Rabbi Yochanan said they'll be Chayiv the Mammon because they're not getting the Malkos, they're not getting the Misa. Rish Lakish Omer Potter. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Chayiv the Halo Aser Bey. There's no Malkos because there was no Asra. Rish Lakish Omer Potter. Even the Ilo Aser Bey. Since had you warned them, this would have been the type of oynish that would pater you from Esau. Pater, so therefore, Kilo Asher Beinami, even if they weren't warned and they weren't able to actually get the punishment, they're still pater from paying the Mammon.
So he would get off scot-free?
Indeed scot-free, but not 100% scot-free. Because we're trying to discuss what happens if the Nizik seizes the money. So the most of the Mepharshim say if the Nizik seized the money, although we don't believe in vigilante justice, but if the Nizik did seize the money, in the event that they never gave him Malkos because there was no Asra, then we would allow the Nizik to keep the money. But in the event that the person actually got the Chiyuv, they gave him the Malkos, or they actually killed him, then the Nizik would have to give back the money, even though he seized it. So there is a little bit of a difference. And there's also a Chiyuv to pay B'dei Shemayim. This is all B'dei Odom. B'dei Shemayim, if the person was interested in doing tshuva, he would have to pay his debt in full anyway, even though he's getting Malkos, or even though he's getting killed. Esvei Freit to Gemara. Esvei Rish Lakish for Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish asked the question to Rabbi Yochanan, and I love these types of Gemaras because whenever the Gemara brings a raya from one place, and we have two Lashonis, and they each come at it from two opposite angles, I always find it fascinating. What to one person is a raya one way can be to the other person a raya 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And it says in the pasuk, this is referring to the people who were fighting and they mistakenly punched a woman and her vlados died. So it says v'lo yeh asayin, if she doesn't get killed and therefore there's no chiyuv misa on the perpetrator, anish anish, only over there do we mandate that the vlados are paid for, the chiyuv moment. My love, how do you interpret this pasuk at first glance? Also in mamish, which means, Rashi, im loy meisa ha'isha, there's no tragedy. What would have been the tragedy? The tragedy that would have been is that the woman died. So if the woman didn't die, then it's anish anish. But if the woman actually dies, it's not anish anish. Well, just because the woman actually dies, that doesn't automatically mean that there'll be a chiyuv misa on the perpetrator. We haven't even discussed if there was hasra there. So the pashas of the pasuk is, if there was no tragedy, meaning if the woman didn't die, mashma, if the woman died, whether or not that triggers a chiyuv misa on the perpetrator is irrelevant. There will still be no tashlumin of the knas. So you have a right to Rish Lakish that even chayv misa shogegin will pater the tashlumin. Zok Gemara lo, you're not reading this right. Din asay. When it says v'mlo asay, it's not going on the woman; it's going on the perpetrator. V'mlo asay, if the perpetrator will not be judged with a chiyuv misa, then he pays. And if he's judged with a chiyuv misa, then he doesn't pay. So therefore, chayv misa shogegin would not necessarily pater you from paying. That's one way to look at this pasuk. But Ika de Amrei, we were coming at it from the completely opposite direction. Rabbi Yochanan was actually bringing a right to his side from Rish Lakish. V'lo yasay anish yanish. My love din asay. Pashas means v'lo yasay. If the perpetrator will not be subject to a chiyuv misa for murdering, then he has to pay for the v'lados. But if he is not subject to a chiyuv misa, he has to pay for the v'lados. So you see, chayv misha shogegin. There's not a party for mammon. Now that Rish Lakish responds, lo yasay mamish. We're focusing on whether or not the woman's victim died. If she died, then there will be no chiyuv mammon, even though the perpetrator might not be subject to a chiyuv misa because he was not one. So based on where we're holding right now, sai by chayv misa shogegin, which means had he been warned, he would have been chiyuv misa, but he was not warned, so he's not chiyuv misa. And sai by chayv Malkos shogegin, had he been warned, he would have gotten Malkos, but he wasn't warned, so he's not getting Malkos. Either way, Rish Lakish holds that there would be no tashlumin, and Rabbi Yochanan holds that there would be tashlumin. Zok the Gemara, Amar Rav, umi ikol aman the Amar chayv misa shogegin chayavim. Does anybody hold that chayv misa shogegin is chayiv? In other words, is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan agrees that chayv misa shogegin are chayiv because there's not an actual chiyuv misa? I'll show you that it's not a matter of discussion amongst Amirayim, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. It's a brisa that says, in fact, that there will not be a chiyuv mammon, even though there's no actual chiyuv misa, because there was no hasra. Because B'Tanya de Chizkiah, we learned a brisa that was quoted by Chizkiah in the Bismerish of Chizkiah. Maka Adam u'Maka Behema. The pasuk talks about Maka Adam, and it talks about Maka Behema. It says Maka Behema Yishalmena or Maka Adam Yumas. So there's a hekesh between Nezikin, when someone damages someone's animal, and Misa, when someone kills his friend. And we learned the following similarity. Ma Maka Behema. Loichi lak the boy ben bishagi ben bemezed ben mischaven l'shein mischaven ben der chvida l'der chalia l'paitrei mama in el l'chayve mama. Just like when you do damage to somebody's property, it doesn't matter how you did the damage. It doesn't matter whether it was b'shoig or amazing. It doesn't matter if you intended to damage, if you didn't. Adamud loydom. It doesn't matter what position you're holding the sledgehammer in when you do the damage. Nothing matters. You're always chayiv because adamud loydom. Ela l'chayv moment. You're always chayiv. Af maka adam. So too this halacha that when you kill a person, you're potter from payment. Loy sachlik boy. don't make any distinction between the shagig ben b'mezid. Whether or not you murdered somebody, don't make a distinction whether it's shagig and mezid. In other words, it doesn't matter whether they're actually getting the oynish of misa. Bein mischaven l'she'ein mischaven. Bein derech yerida l'derech aliyah. When it comes to hilchos ritzicha, we know if you're holding an axe and you're on the downswing and you kill somebody, that's where you go into golus. That's where there's a chi of golus. But if you're lifting the axe up because you're doing the backswing, you're winding up and you hit somebody on the way back, that doesn't have the chi of misa. But it doesn't matter. Since we're dealing with death, which is a chi of misa in general, it'll all be put. So when you're dealing with a chi of mama that was triggered at the same time as a chi of misa could have been triggered, no matter what, there will be no chiyuv to pay the mama. So you see clearly from Tanakh V'Chizkiah that chayv and misha shagin are potter to pay when it's a question of misa. So how could we say earlier that Rabbi Yochanan holds that chayv and misha shagin will be chayv to pay? This brisa says beferish that you don't pay, and Rabbi Yochanan cannot argue on the brisa. Ella, he also Ravin Omar. When Ravin came along, he argued on what we learned until now, and he said, everybody holds that if it's a question of chayv and misha shogegin, it's something that would have had a death penalty. But for some technicality, it doesn't because it's shogeg, because it's not shrah, or whatever reason, you're still going to be put there from a payment of moment. But keep ligi, where Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish argue, or bechayv and malchus shogegin the dovarach. If at the same time that there was a chiv malchus triggered, such as in our Mishnah's case, where there was a violation of a woman who had a chiv karis, and therefore there's a chiv malchus, Rabbi Yochanan or chayiv, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the person would be chayiv, and therefore he's able to interpret our Mishnah as saying the chiv knas is because there was no asra for the malchus, and therefore there'll be a chiv knas. And Rish Lakish holds not. Rabbi Yochanan or chayiv, because chayv and mises is skish, chayv and malchus lo yiskish. Yes, the Tanakh V'Chizkiah brought a hekesh between misa and moment, but that hekesh only applies to a verse that are makay adam, that have a chiyuv misa. But that hekesh does not apply to chiyuvim that are chiyuv malchus, and therefore chiyuv malchus will only part you for a moment if the malchus is actually being carried out. But Rish Lakish are potter. Rish Lakish holds even chayv malchus shogegin will be potter from tashlumim because the ferish rips a Torah chayv malchus to chayv misas. Because we know from the hekesh that chayv misas, even if you don't actually carry out the death sentence, will still potter a payment of mammon, and we have a hekesh to tell us that the same halacha that applies to chayv misas applies to chayv malchus as well. Hechen rips a Torah. Where do you see this connection? Abaye Asher Rasha Rasha, and Rashi says, "Nemer b'chayv misais asher hu Rasha lamus." So the Torah tells us, referring to the chiyuv misa, the Torah uses a phrase of asher hu Rasha lamus. The Nemer b'chayv malchus v'haya bin akoisa Rasha. So since each of these two punishments, misa and malchus, are referred to by the Torah with the word Rasha, we say that just like we know independently that chayv misais shogegin parted you from tashlumin, and that we know because of the hekesh from chayv misa to chayv mammon, so too this principle applies as well to chayv malchus. That's the proof that Abaye brings. Rav Amar, I don't need to learn this halacha from chayv misais to chayv malchus because I have a direct link from chayv malchus directly to a chiyuv mammon. Asya maka maka. You can learn maka maka direct. So Rashi says, Rav Amar Asya maka maka. The malchus nami ishkis the maka behema. Malchus has a direct connection to maka behema, so we could learn that same limud. They are just like by maka behema, no matter what, you're always chayiv. So too by chiyuv malchus, no matter what, you're always parted from tashlum. The lav migzer shaved the chayv misa shaltiman. We're not learning chayv malchus through chayv misa. There's a direct limud from chayv malchus to maka behema. Omar Papa l'Rav. Papa asked Rav, okay, you have this gzeir shava of maka maka. Let's see where it is. Show me the money. Hi Maka. Which word Maka are you referring to? Ilema, the pasuk says Umaka behema yishalmena, Umaka adam yumas, which is the same pasuk that we brought earlier from Misa. Haibik Talaksid. That's not referring to Malkus. That's referring to a place of Chiv Misa. Elahai Maka, it must be referring to a different place where Nezikin and Chiv Malkis are there together. It says Maka Nefesh behema yishalmena, Nefesh tachas nefesh. The Samach Lay, and nearby it says the Ishkiit in Mumba Misai, where there's a Chiv Malkus there, Kasher Asa Kenya Yasala. Correct, it's a very nice hekesh there, but if you notice, the second pasuk does not use the word Makkah. So you're telling me we're learning Makkah, but Bahai Lav Makahi. It doesn't say in the second pasuk the word Makkah. Zok Gemara, it doesn't need to. Anan Haka Karmina. It says the Ishkiit in Mumba Misai, Kasher Asa Kenya Yasala. No, it doesn't say refers to the word Makkah. But what does it mean, Nitin Mubamisa? You hit him. That's all we're saying. Oh, very good. So it's we're just learning it because they're both talking about the same thing. Okay, so you have me over there, but we still have a problem. Where does it say this pasuk? It says it by Chayvul B'Chaverei. And V'Chayvul B'Chaverei Bar Tashlumanu. By Chayvul B'Chaverei, where there's a Chiv Malkus, we learned through special limudim that there's an exception. There, even though there's a Chiv Malkus there, you do pay. So you can't bring me Raya mamish from the place where you do pay mamon that you won't pay mamon when there's a Chiv Malkus. Zok Gemara Einu Chanami. But we don't need this pasuk to tell you that there's a Chiv to pay mamon by a Nakash Yesh B'Shav Pruta. Why, Zok Rashi? Because the Chsiv Kaini Nosen Boy, Davar Anitim Yad Liad, we already know that. So therefore, Taneu Inyan Lakosh Ein B'Shav Pruta. So therefore, say it's an extra pasuk, and we'll apply it to a case where there was a kosh Ein B'Shav Pruta, meaning in that particular case of Chavala, there was no payment because there wasn't enough damage. In such a case, there would be Malkus given for the Chavala. Frank the Gemara, that's not a good raya at all. Because soy, at the end of the day, la bar tashlumu. So weiter, you don't see that there's a payment. We're still trying to prove that when there's a chiv malchus, there will not be a chiv mammon. But over there, and the limit was just like by Chavala, no matter what, there's always mammon. So too, by Chayv Malchus, there's never a Chiv Mammon. The problem is over there wasn't a Chiv Mammon. So at the end of the day, since you're saying that there's no Tashlumin over there because the damages weren't enough, so there's no place that we can compare it to that's always Chayv Mammon. So Rashi highlight Sachlik by the Chayv Mammon, right? The first part of the Hekesh is just like by a case of Mammon. No matter what, Adamud Loyal will always be a Chiv Mammon, but in this case, there's still no Chiv Mammon. Taima, Mishum De'ema Kedei Tashlumin. There's no hekesh over here, because over here the reason why we're going to suggest that there's no chiyuv mammon when there's a chiyuv malchus is because there was no chiyuv mammon, because there's no value in it. Maybe in fact, if there was damages that have a value to them, maybe then you wouldn't get malchus. Maybe then you would get mammon. So how could you bring me a raya from here that whenever there's malchus, there'll be no chiyuv mammon? We're going to have to say that the case that's getting more and more dachel. We're going to say that the case that the pasuk is referring to, since you don't need it to tell me that there's a chiyuv tashlumin because it already says yad biyad. So apply to a case where there was no chiyuv tashlumin, and that's where there's malchus because the damages on the caused by the hakah, by the chavala, were less than Shabbat Pruta, but there's another thing that happened at that time. The behind the mochya kara shiroin delay, because when I punched him in the middle of Chavala, I also tore his shirt, and even that we're saying by the moment he's going to be chayv. There's Dr. Gemara. The behind the machi kara shiroin kleimer basheminian the loike mishum Chavala upatim at the shlimi kriya, and we learn that. Just like in the case of mammon, you're always chayiv when you cause damage. So too, when you're chayiv malchus, you'll be potter from any damages. So the Torah for the damages of the chavala are not a riot because they're less than a shavapruta. But here you also caused financial damage by tearing your shirt. We're saying, the Hekesh is saying that if he tore a shirt while you were beating him up, you were going to be potter from paying for the shirt because loy chalakta. And you'll be potter from paying the damages to his outfit. And the Hekesh tells us that the tour of the potential for the Chiv Malkos, partition from the Chiv Mammon that occurred simultaneously, whether or not the Chiv Malkos is actually carried out, even if the person wasn't warned. The loy lucky still potter mitashlumin meikeshet loy sachlei. From the Hekesh that when you're comparing it to a Chiv of damages, which you pay no matter what, so too when there's Malkos, you don't pay for simultaneous damages no matter what.
He hits him, damages him, injures him.
There he is, because there's a special pasuk that tells us that by chavala we don't look at the malchus, we look at the payment, and we have you pay. So that's we're not bringing a riot from. That's a different case. We're bringing a riot from a case where when you hurt him, you also tore his shirt, and then you wouldn't pay for his shirt.
You only damage you're only damage to his body, not to his.
Correct, because the chiddush that we learned a couple of days ago by chavala, that even though there's a chiv malchus, you pay, that only applies to the damages that he incurred because of the injury.
If you went up to somebody and you tore their shirt, you're responsible for tearing their shirt. So,
unless there was a chiv malchus occurring simultaneously. So the chiv malchus that we're using happens to be because you hit the guy. Yeah.
If you're going to damage somebody, make sure you hit them.
Exactly. If you're going to damage, make sure you're doing a different affair at the same time, because otherwise you'll have to pay. That's correct. And if you want to be a smart apikoris, an amaretz would an apikoris is a glad punish. If he's going to do damage, he should do it with a little chachma and do it in a way he doesn't have to pay. That's right. Because otherwise, he's not only is he a apikoris, he's a namuras also. Okay, everybody knows that famous story where there was a fellow in the city who had great respect. He was known to be the apikoris of the city. But there was another fellow who also didn't believe in the Rosh Hashanah. And he said, how come he gets the distinction as the apikoris in the city, and I don't get such a distinction? So tell him, you're stomach grab amaretz. You don't know anything. He's an apikoris. It's a stature over there. Reb Chia told Rav, according to Tana Devei Chizkiah, the Amar Maka Adam Umaka Behema. In other words, according to the Tana Devei Chizkiah, who makes a whole big riot, and he says, just like by Maka Behema, no matter what, you're always chayiv. So too by Maka Adam, no matter what, you'll never be chayiv for tashlumin because of a potential chiv misa. How do you know that there was a chiv misa there at all? Who said that it's speaking in the weekday, and in the weekday by Maka Adam, there's always going to, who said we're speaking b'choil, and by Maka Behema, there'll always be a tashlumin by Hezek, the lekalaf luge, and therefore, no matter what, no matter how you damage somebody, Adam would will always be chayiv. Who said that's the case of Maka Behema? Dilma b'Shabbos ksiv. Maybe the damage occurred on Shabbos. The Behema gufa ikalaf luge, and therefore, when you're damaging someone's property, you won't necessarily always be chayiv to pay no matter what, because if there was done b'mezid, then you would be potter because there would be a kamal b'drabim. You picked one narrow case, b'choil, where no matter what, there'll always be a chiv mammon, and because of that, you want to say when there's malchus, there's never a chiv mammon. Who said? Maybe the chiv to pay for damages to the behema also depends on whether or not it was done b'shoigig or b'mezid, and you don't say it's chayiv across the board. For instance, if the pasuk happens to be speaking about a case where this occurred even on Shabbos, Zok Gemara lo yisal kadai. If you look at the pasuk and analyze it, you'll see it's impossible that the pasuk is speaking about a case where this occurred on Shabbos. Why? Because it says in the pasuk, "Umake behema yishalmena, umake adam yumas." So we have to assume that in the same circumstances, that when you do damage to someone's property, you're chayiv to pay the mammon. Under those same circumstances, if you killed somebody, you would be chayiv. So hechidam, what are those circumstances? If there was no warning, a person would not get killed if if he murdered without any warning. So of course, this pasuk must be speaking where the perpetrator was warned in advance that he's not allowed to do what he's doing. So let's think about it. If this pasuk was speaking about a story that occurred on Shabbos and he was warned, he wouldn't have to pay for the damages that he did because there's a kamei b'derabim because he became a chuyav misa for violating the Shabbos at that time. It must be that this pasuk we're making this hekesh. It must be that this occurred during the weekday, and therefore we have a beautiful hekesh. Just like if you damage someone's property on the weekday, it doesn't matter how or where you damage the property; it's always going to be chayiv. So too, if you killed a person where there's a chiyav misa involved, no matter what, you'll be potter from any simultaneous trigger to a chiyav of payment. So here's where it's going to get a little bit complicated, because we have so many different shittas that we've discussed how to understand the Mishnah. We had Rabbi Loi who told us that you have a chiyuv. Not Rabbi Loi. We had Ula who said that if there's a chiyuv mammon and a chiyuv Malkos, you trigger the chiyuv mammon. You trigger the chiyuv mammon, and he had to learn that the only time you get Malkos, like in the case of Eid in Eloikin, was where there was no chiyuv mammon. Right? He had to say it's in an unusual case where you violated a woman, but it wasn't onions, it was mafuta, and she was a yisayma, so she's moichel. Only in that narrow case could the Mishnah over there be talking about where you get Malkos. And then you had Rabbi Yochanan who said, no, if there's Malkos and there's Knas, you would get Malkos. So you have to learn that our Mishnah in the Illinois is speaking where there was no Asra, right? And now we had a third Shita who said in Reb Meir that it's like Umashalim. And we have now Rabbah who says that in the case where it's like Umashalim, according to Reb Meir, Knas, you never say the din of Kamlei b'derabim, even if there's a death involved. So Amalei Apapal Abaye, let's sort out the Shitas now. L'Rabbah, according to Rabbah, the Omer Chidushu Shechitcha Torah b'Knas. Rabbah said that the reason why Reb Meir was mechayiv somebody dalad v'hei, even though the shechita was on Shabbos, is because there's a chiddush shechita Torah that whenever there's a chiyuv knas, there is no rule of kamei b'derabim. The afagav the miktal mishalim, even though the person is being killed for his action because it's violated Shabbos, nevertheless there would still be the chiyuv knas. So based on that, masnisin kaman mukamla. According to Rabbah, how in the world is he going to understand our Mishnah, which says as follows? If there's a chiyuv misa, there will be no din knas. If there's a chiyuv kares, there will be a din knas. And if there's a chiyuv malchus, we don't know yet. So Zaktim or Iker of Meir, if you're going to explain our Mishnah is following the sheet of Reb Meir, who held loika umeshali, that's how a shlokish learned our Mishnah. It's saying, speaking, even though you get malchus, you still have to pay. Kasha bitay, it's going to be shver bitay, because in the case of bitay, there's a chiyuv misa, and our Mishnah hold when there's a chiyuv misa b'dei adam, like bitay, there would be no din knas. But according to Rabbah, the way he understood Reb Meir, even if there's a chiyuv misa b'dei adam, there would be a din knas. So Rabbah will not be able to explain the Mishnah like Rish Lakish did and say that we're following the sheet of Reb Meir, who says loiku mishalim, because according to Rabbah's understanding of Reb Meir, not only is it loiku mishalim, even if there's a chiyuv misa, you have to pay knas. And our Mishnah doesn't hold like that. Our Mishnah holds that bitay would not be mechuyev to pay knas. So Rabbah doesn't have that option. Ikrab nechunya v'nakana, and if you want to say he's going according to nechunya v'nakana, kasha chayzer. Nechunya v'nakana said that even by chorus you say kamei b'derabim. So our Mishnah doesn't make sense according to Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. As a matter of fact, we learned earlier that in fact Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana argues on our Mishnah, because he holds even if there was a chiyuv chorus, you would be part from tashlumin. Clearly, our Mishnah says in the case of a chiyuv chorus, you're chayiv in tashlumin. Ikar Rabbi Yitzchak. So Rabbi Yitzchak is a shita that we have not yet discussed. Rabbi Yitzchak's shita is that chayiv creases don't get malchus. Up until now, we assume that it is chayiv. The Gemara asks the kasha, I ain't like kumashalim, because the Gemara understood by default that if there's chorus here, automatically there's a chiyuv malchus. Rabbi Yitzchak goes no. Chiyuv Kares does not necessarily come with a Chiyuv Malkus. So therefore, our Mishnah, you could say there is no Chiyuv Malkus on it. And if you could say in our Mishnah that there's no Chiyuv Malkus, then we no longer have to say that our Mishnah is going according to Reb Meir, who holds like a Mashallah, because in fact there's no Chiyuv Malkus, and that's why it's Mashallah. But the problem is, then it's Kosher Mamzeres, because by Mamzeres, there's a Chiyuv Lav there, and it's not a Chiyuv Kares. So by Mamzeres, for sure, there's a Chiyuv Malkus. And if there's a Chiyuv Malkus, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, it would be potter from paying the Knas. So Rabbah is a little bit in a difficult situation. How is he going to explain our Mishnah? Zok the Gemara. Hanicha Yisavar Lach Rabbi Yochanan. If you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that you only get Malkus if you're warned, but you don't get Malkus if you're not warned, then he could still learn that the Mishnah is going according to, he could still say that the Gemara, the Mishnah is going according to the Rabbanon, who hold that Ein Loiku Mishalim, but our Mishnah is speaking in a case where there was no Asra, so there's no Malkus, so it's a non-issue. So who nami mitaris like Rabbi Yochanan? Hilum Jitak Rabbi Yochanan is that our Mishnah is going according to Rabbanon, that argue under Meir and hold in fact that Ein Loiku Mishalim, but there's no Malkus over here. And the Gabi the Chiyuv Kares, our Mishnah also holds that if there's a Chiyuv Kares, you do pay. That's correct. Our Mishnah speaks without Asra. But if Rabbah is going to hold like Rish Lakish, that even though there's no Asra, it would still be potter from the Tashlumin, how in the world will Rabbah be able to understand our Mishnah? Dr. Gemara, what's wrong? Let's say that Rabbah will learn our Mishnah like Rabbi Yochanan, and the learner is going according to the Rabbanan. And the reason why there's a Chiyuv Knas here is because there's no actual Malchus, because there was no Asra. Period. Amalei Rab Masna la Abaye. Rab Masna asked Abaye the following question. L'Reish Lakish, according to Reish Lakish, who holds the Omar beferish ripsa Torah chayve Malchus kechayve Misais. Reish Lakish said that chayve Malchus are like chayve Misais, meaning even if there's no actual Malchus, even if there's no Asra, you'll still be potter from the Shlumin. And that's why Rish Lakish had to learn that our Mishnah is going according to Reb Meir, who says Loiku Mishalim. Tana the Palagalei, the Reb Nuchanya ben Akana. So who is the Tana of our Mishnah who says that even though there's a Chiyuv Kares, you do pay the Knas? Zokim Reb Meir, which is what we've been saying until now, that our Mishnah is going according to Reb Meir, who holds Loika Umishalim. And even if there was no actual Malchus, you'll still say Aloikum Mishalim, it doesn't matter. Or Rabbi Yitzchak, or if you don't want to go according to Reb Meir, you could go according to Rabbi Yitzchak, who says that there is no Chiyuv Malchus at all for a Chayve Krisos, and therefore, since there's no Chayve Malchus for Chayve Krisos, therefore, even though there's Chayve Krisos here, you would still pay Knas. Rashi adds, Lamaisa, you still have the problem according to Rabbi Yitzchak, like the Gemara said earlier, Mamzer. Our Mishnah also says that a Mamzer pays Knas. And by a Mamzer, there is actually Malchus. And according to Rish Lakish, even if you don't actually get the Malchus, because you didn't get a Hasra, you would still be part from Tashlum. So when it says Ik Rabbi Yitzchak, Rashi says it's not referring to our Mishnah, but it's referring to other Mishnayos that discuss people who are potter from Tashlumin, even though they're not actually getting Malchus. So Rashi actually tells us it's referring to this Mishnah in Malchus, where it says as follows. Rashi gives us an example of where it's referring to. Let me just see Rashi inside. It's a little bit further down over here. He says over here, Shavuos, the case of Shavuos will be Ben Kremer again Kerbitok, and the case of Shavuos is Shehidlit Gadish b'Yom Kippurim. If someone lit a Gadish on Yom Kippurim, so over there's a Chiyuv Kares. There's a Chiyuv Kares. So and the halacha is he holds over there that you're chayiv. Why? Because he'll have to hold and we know there's a Chiyav Malkus that comes together with a Chiyav Karis. So according to Rish Lakish, that should be potter, because even if you don't actually give Malkus, it's considered like you had Malkus. So if you learn like Rabbi Yitzchak, then that will explain the Gemara there, because then you would hold that there is no Chiyav Malkus for someone who does a malacha on Yom Kippur. Beautiful. It's Karis. It's Karis, but the Karis is not a problem because we don't have to hold like Rabbi Yechunya by the Khan. We learn like Rabbanan that only a Chiyav Misa b'di Adam patters you from Tashlum. But the problem is the shita that holds that even Chayve or Rish Lakish holds that even if you don't actually get the Malkus, you'll still be pater from Tashlum. Anytime there's a Chiyav Karis, there's automatically a Chiyav Malkus. So if someone in the Chal Kippur, he gets Malkus. It's Karis. The Chiyav Karis for someone who does Malacha on Kippur.
Is there a real Chiyav Malkus, or only if you get Malkus, you get food?
No. You could only, the Malkus only patters you on Karis because there's a Chiyav Malkus there. And if you get the Oyush of Malkus, then it patters you from the Karis.
Somebody's Mechali on Kippurim and so about
If you had a Sra. You're bringing up one of the biggest machlokim that ever happened in the history of Judaism, because by the Spanish Inquisition, all of the Moranos were Chayav Karis. They didn't have mikvahs, and since they didn't have mikvahs, they were all over living with their wives when they were needed. As a matter of fact, the most of the people, when they were told they have to convert, they said, "I'm not converting," so they left with the clothing on their backs. They had to give everything up. That was a very big sign. People were very wealthy. So the Moranos were those who succumbed because they weren't able to walk away from all of their financial success. Because of that, the Eden that left with the clothing on their back and moved to Holland, they despised the Moranos. And I have a friend, he's a Sephardi, but he has a suffix to his name, Samach Tes, Sephardi Tahar, because they wanted to be distinct. So what happened was imagine after all these years, the Moranos came out, and they didn't want to become Eden. They said, why should I become a Yid? I have Chayav Karis, the Zelbaba, so what, I should become a Yid, So what happened is they wanted to give people Malkus, the Potter. How did they want to give Malkus? Stop, if you give a guy Malkus, it's not called Malkus, it's called hitting a guy. It has to have the Psakalocha Malkus, but you don't have Bezdin. And we don't have real Musmachim anymore, because Moshe Rabbeinu got Tzmicha on the Rebbeinu Shalom, and that chain broke during the Korban. So there's a Rambam, both in Pirush Mishnayos and Yad Chazaka, where people were medayik from the Rambam that there's a way to reestablish Smicha without having that chain. That is, if Roy Chachmei Yisrael agree that a person should be Musmach, he will become Musmach, and then he can now pass it on to other people. So it was a huge patent. They'll create a new Bezdin, and by creating a new Bezdin, they'll give these people Malkus, and then they'll be Potter from Karas, and now they can start over. That was the patent. Who devised this system? The Gedolim, and there was a major Gedolim at the time in Tzvas. And the dying over there was the Maribe Rav. And this entire story is actually recorded in the Shalos Trubis Maribe Rav that we have over here in the Oitzah. So what he did was he came up with this unbelievable idea. He's going to establish Shmicha. So all of the Gedolim of Tzvas decided that who is the first person that's going to receive this new Shmicha? The Mar al-Bach, who is the Rav HaRosh in Yerushalayim. So they sent him a letter. They thought he'd be so flattered. We're giving you smicha. And there was a little bit of resentment that what you guys in Tzfas are going to make. In Yerushalayim, we pass these things. You can't make up these things in Tzfas. So the Mariba, okay, fine. So why don't you analyze it with your Bezdin, independent of us, and you'll come to the conclusion. So the Marabach says, I can't anymore. I'm going to give it up. So because of that, this whole thing is a moot point. We can't do it anymore. And they were going back and forth as to whether or not they should be able to reenact the smicha. So you see the letters going back and forth started off very professional, but they ended up becoming very nasty and very personal. It ended up being a big machlokes. So at the beginning, there were some tinus that the Marabach said would be a very bad idea. So first of all, even if we could make dayanim, we can't give a guy Malkus, there's no asra. So I'm giving a guy Malkus because we're a Bezdin. There was no Asra. So the Malkus wouldn't work anyway. So your whole plan doesn't work. That was one of the times that he had. Another time that he had is the only reason why we're able to use the calendar today to know when Rosh Chodesh is only because we don't have Bezdin. But if we have Bezdin, we have to go back to the Mekash Piaria. And in those days where they didn't have communications, it would mess up the Yom Tovim for everybody because nobody would know what went on. It would be a disaster. It got so nasty that at one point the Merabach told the Maribe Rav, I know why you want the smicha, because I remember the type of things that you used to do when you were a young bocher. And you need the own kapara. You probably are chayv first, and you probably need a kapara. So that's how nasty it got as the conversations were going back and forth. Exactly. The Beis Yosef was the one who ended up. He was one of the chachmei of Tzva, so he ended up accepting the smicha. Okay, we'll stop here, and in Mitchem we will be mamshich tomorrow. Baruch Hashem, I finished before 6:50.
Fair.
Not the Shabbos.